Hello everyone and welcome to a new video with a CS Revelation. This is a new video on Java programming. Today's video is on variables. Now to keep it simple and to explain what variables are and how we can use them, let's visualize the idea of variable. So first, let's think of variables as if like they are just simple containers in which we are going to be storing some data. Now, first of all, any variable must have a variable name. And also, there must be a specific type of data that this variable is going to be able to store. So data will be placed in these variables to store them for later, so we can use them in some, let's say, calculations or some other procedures and so on. So in simple words, we say that variables are containers for storing data values. Now, of course, data is of different types. And if you define, let's say, a certain variable to be, let's say, with this name city and has a specific type, let's say string here, we'll talk more about variables and data types in the next video. But today we're just going to focus on the idea of a variable and how does it store data and so on. So we said that the first container here has a name city and has a type string. And the second container here has a name zip code and has a type integer. That means it can store variables values of type integers. Now we have two data here. So we have 10040 and we have Queens in quotation marks. So Queens here is text, which means it is a string value type. 10040 here is a whole number, and therefore it's considered an integer. So the blue value here is compatible with the container that is named zip code and has the type integer. So we can only place it in a variable or a container that is made to store that specific type. Same thing with Queens here. It can only be stored in a container that is made to contain that type of values. So 10040 will be placed in this container and Queens will be placed in the other container. So this is just the simplest way to think of variables. Now let's just dig deeper and think more technical. First of all, we are saying that these variables are containers and these containers must be placed somewhere. Now, we should all know that these variables will be placed in memory, more specifically RAM, random access memory, and that's where these variables will be created and will reside. So earlier we said variables are containers to store certain values. Now let's think about them as a memory space that is reserved in RAM memory. So it's a reserved memory space in RAM. So if we zoom into, let's say, RAM, we will find that we have, for example, the first variable, which is of name city and of type string. Right? And the value that we placed in it is Queens. So this is a reserved memory space in our RAM memory that has a name, has a type, and can store certain values. Same thing here. So we have this reserved orange memory space here that contains or stores a certain value. It has a name, and it has a certain data type specifying like what values can be stored in that memory space. So we shouldn't think about them now as containers. We know now that they are reserved memory spaces in RAM, random access memory. And these memory spaces have a type, have a name, and can contain some values. Now, in Java, there are various data types, and there's a whole video that I'm going to post after this one. That video is going to talk more about these data types. But for now, to keep it simple, let's think of some of the examples of data types that variables can have. So a string is for storing text values. Example, let's say like Brooklyn or Queens, like we saw earlier. Hello. 1, 2, 3 in quotes, that is a string value, that's text, that's not considered a number. So we're talking about the character 1, the character 2, the character 3. And all string values must be surrounded with double quotation marks. There's another type which is char, and that is for single character values. So example A, B, and single quotation marks will be used for variables or values of type char. Also, we have the int data type, and that's for integers, whole numbers that do not contain decimal values. So it does not allow storing values with decimal parts into them. Only whole numbers are compatible. So example, there's 1, 2, 3, there's negative 1, 2, 3. So it's either positive or negative. Also, we have the double data type. Also, we have float. We'll talk more about this in the next video. So double, that is if you would like to store whole numbers in addition to numbers with decimal values. So for example, here 15.25 or negative 15.25 could be stored there. Also, like whole numbers can also be stored in a double variables. Boolean is another data type, and that is for values with two possible states. So for example, if the value is either true or false, then we declare a variable of type Boolean, and the values that would be stored in there is true or false. Now let's dig into this. So let's start typing some code and let's see how we declare these variables and how do we use them. Okay, so let's start typing some code here. So the first thing that we want to learn is how to declare a variable. We say declare or create. So we're going to learn the declaration of a variable means that we want to know how to reserve that memory space. Now here's the syntax for reserving that memory space or declaring the variable. First thing, you want to state the data type of this variable, followed by the variable name. And here's an example. Let's say we are to create the variable city that we saw earlier. So the data type for that is string. City is the name for that variable, and semicolon. So this code here, this statement here, is going to allow us to reserve a memory space that is going to have a name city and is going to be capable of storing values of type string. Now, the next thing that we want to know is how to assign. So how to assign a value into city variable. So we have created this variable called city. Now we want to learn how can we store values into it, and that is called an assignment statement. And in order for us to use the assignment statement, we use the assignment operator. So here's the syntax. You want the variable name, and then the assignment operator, which is the equal sign, then you will put the value. So example, let's say what we want to do here is that we want to assign, earlier we said Queens into city. So the variable must be on the left side, the variable name that's receiving the value must be on the left side of the assignment operator, which is the equal sign. And the value is of type string. It must be in quotation marks. So let's say Brooklyn here. Now, notice that the assignment happens in this direction, which is right to left. So what's on the right here will be stored in what's on the left of the equal sign here. So the assignment is in one direction. So the value will be assigned to the variable. So now we could simply say that we have stored the value Brooklyn, which is a string value, in the city variable. Now, we can also do this in a 2-in-1 process. That means we could declare the variable and also assign the value at the same time. So let's see the 2-in-1 process. So that was done in 2 steps. Now we can see 2-in-1 process. So we could say, let's create another variable. So let's say string state. And we're going to say equal the value that we want to assign it to. So let's say New York. Okay. So here we have assigned the value New York into this variable state that is of type string. So this one statement here has done 2 things: declare the variable and also assign the value into it. Now, it really depends on what you want to accomplish with your application, because sometimes you know you need a variable in which you're going to store the city, but you don't know the value yet until, let's say, later on in your program, you will find out that value, so you will assign it to that variable. So therefore, you could do it this way, which is that you declare the variable first and then assign the value once you have that value. Or if you know ahead of time what value you're going to be assigning to the variable, you could do it in just one line. Also know that the value of a variable can be overridden. That means you could change the value, even though that you have assigned a value into it, you can actually override that. And when overriding that value, let's say changing the value that's stored in that variable, you simply use the assignment operator, the equal sign, and let's say you assign New Jersey into it. Now, you didn't need to declare this variable again because that variable already exists in memory. But we have New York into it. That value is in state. So that value New York is stored in state variable. But when you run the statement, it will discard the current value that's stored in state and replace it with the new value. So this is called overriding the existing value that's in state with a new value. Now, this is how we declare string values. Let's take a look at how we can declare, let's say, integer value. Another example, just to practice the declaration of variables. So an integer value, say we want to declare the variable, earlier we said zip code. So the data type is int, and the name of the variable will be zip code. Now, I'll talk a little bit in few about naming. So this line of code here, we have created the variable and we specified its type, its name, and we assigned this value into it. Now, technically, this has reserved the memory space, gave it a name, and gave it a type. And this part here has assigned the value, this integer value, into it. Now, if we were to attempt to assign Brooklyn, for example, into zip code, let's try that. So the variable name is zip code, which is of type integer. Let's say we attempt to assign a value that is of type string. So notice here that this is rendered an error message. It's telling you, hey, if you hover over this, it's incompatible types. String cannot be converted into an integer. Means that you are trying to assign a string value into a variable that can only hold or store variable of type integer. So you've defined this variable to store integer values, but you're trying to assign a value that is of type string, which is incompatible. So this is not going to be allowed. Okay, so now let's talk about the naming process for variable. Of course, naming has to follow some rules, and you are not allowed to actually use some certain formats. So, for example, this is what we should avoid. So, when naming a variable, it must not start with a digit. So here's, for example, if we were to declare the following variable, let's say int, let's say we wanted to call this first num, right? And you see that it's highlighted here as an error, a syntax error. That is, well, technically the error message is not helpful here because it says it's expecting a semicolon, but we have that. But that is just because it's complaining that the variable here has an invalid name. It cannot have a name that start with a number digit. So if I remove that, you see the name now is rendered valid, and it's not underlined. It means it's not an error message. So again, you cannot start a variable with a number. One more thing also cannot, let's change this to first num. So also you cannot have a name that includes spaces. So if you have, let's say, like first space num here, Java does not allow that. Again, it says expected semicolon. But what is really happening here is that this space is not allowed. So you cannot include spaces. A name of a variable must be one word. Of course, you can fix this by using, let's say, the underscore. That's going to turn this into a one word. This is a special character that is allowed, but there are some special characters that are not allowed when naming a variable. For example, let's suppose that instead of putting an underscore there, we put, let's say, the @ symbol. So again, it's going to tell you that it's an illegal start of type. What really means that we cannot use this special character when naming a variable. Also, they say the $sign is allowed here, but they say the exclamation mark is not allowed. So that's a special character. The reason for that is because they say like that special character is actually reserved for certain commands. In later videos, you will see what these commands or symbols are reserved for, and we are going to avoid them when naming our variables. So these are some of the special characters that should be avoided when naming a variable. See here the special character as well. Let's say the asterisk is not allowed. But you see, like if you include numbers in the middle of the name, then that's allowed. But if it was at the beginning, then it's not going to be allowed. So that's something that you should put in mind. Numbers cannot be used at the beginning of the variable name. A variable name must not contain special characters. A variable name must not have a space. It has to be a single word for that name. So that is about naming the variables, something very important when declaring your variables. Now, this is the end of this video. It's a quick video on variables and how to declare them, how to assign values into them. In the next video, we are going to be learning data types, the differences between data types. In addition, we're going to start using variables. We're going to learn how we can use or incorporate variables into some calculations or other processes. And we're going to learn how we can generate some type of an outcome. Now, I hope you found this video helpful in understanding variables. And till the next one, peace.